How does the Buddha view reality? We're going to use the 3 marks of existence teaching to uncover the 3 aspects of reality that the Buddha views as essential to realize. Human beings suffer simply because of an innocent misunderstanding about the nature of reality. Our misunderstanding, or ignorance as the Buddha calls it, is that things and experiences are solid, permanent, and can provide ultimate satisfaction and have an inherent existence. The Buddha found that the true nature of reality is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and lacks an inherent existence. So the Buddha's teachings tell us that everything, including thoughts, emotions, experiences, are marked by these 3 qualities, or 3 marks of existence. Impermanence, which is anicca in Pali, suffering or dissatisfaction, dukkha, and not self, or anatta. And these 3 aspects apply to all conditioned things. That is, everything except for nirvana. The Buddha taught that a complete understanding of the 3 marks of existence is essential to realizing awakening. So let's look in detail at each one and see how we can see the truth of these by means of practice. Impermanence, or anicca, means that nothing in the universe remains constant, including our thoughts, emotions, and physical form. Nothing in the world is permanent, and everything is transitory, subject to change, constantly evolving. Even the objects we might consider solid and unchanging eventually crumble and fade away. The concept of impermanence may seem self-evident when we behold the wear and tear on our possessions or bodies, but we often conduct ourselves as if the world were unchanging and impermanent. When tragedy strikes or we lose something we hold dear, our natural inclination is to feel overwhelmed with sadness. And this reaction stems from our tendency to cling on to things that are not meant to endure, causing us suffering. When we comprehend and accept the transient nature of all things, we can attain liberation and free ourselves from this kind of suffering. By letting go of our attachment to impermanent things, we can concentrate on the present moment and on what truly holds value and brings happiness. There's a story, it's called Horrible or Wonderful. It's a student goes to a meditation teacher and says, "My meditation's horrible. I feel so distracted. My legs ache and I'm constantly falling asleep. It's just horrible." And the teacher replies matter-of-factly, "It will pass." A week later, the student comes back to the teacher and says, "My meditation's wonderful. I feel so aware, so peaceful, so connected and alive. It's just wonderful." And the teacher again replies matter-of-factly, "It will pass." So everything is impermanent, the good and the bad. There's a parable of the mustard seed that also indicates the teaching on impermanence. Kisa Gotami, a young woman from a poor family, marries into a wealthy family, but faces challenges of not being accepted until she gives birth to a son. And then her son tragically dies, and she's overwhelmed with sadness, is heartbroken. She seeks out the Buddha to see if he can help her. And to her delight, he says, "Yes, I can help you. But first you must bring me a mustard seed, and it must be taken from a household where no one residing in that house has ever lost a family member." Kisa was very pleased and believed that this would be a fairly easy task. So she sets off to the different households. The first one, she asks for a mustard seed, and then the person says, "Oh, yes, I have one." And she goes, "Well, has there been a death in this house?" And the villager nods and tells her a story of the loss of an uncle. Then a similar story unfolds at the next house and the next house and the next. Every household she went to had experienced the death of a family member. As she traveled from house to house and heard story after story, her grief for the loss of her son began to subside. She realized that no house is free from death. She finally let go of her son, laying him in a forest nearby, and returned to the Buddha. And the Buddha asked her, "Do you have the mustard seed?" And she replied, "I do not, but I saw the living are few and the dead are many." She realized that there is no one in the world who has never lost a family member to death. She now understood that death is inevitable and a natural part of life. Viparinama dukkha arises from our inability to accept change. It lies in our attachment to these external factors, which we cling on to as if they were fixed. And this leads to an expectation that they'll bring us enduring happiness. But since everything's changing and transforming, these expectations aren't met. And as a result, we find ourselves grappling with the reality of impermanence and feeling very dissatisfied. Buddhism teaches that our attachment to things creates a cycle of desire and dissatisfaction. We crave for things that we believe will bring us happiness, and once we attain them, we cling to them as if they will do this forever. When these things inevitably change, we're faced with the disappointment, and then the cycle just begins again. And the cycle can only be broken by recognizing the impermanence of all things and letting go of our attachment. Sankhara dukkha is the suffering that comes on account of sankhara, which in English are mental formations, thoughts and emotions. It arises when we concoct shoulds and shouldn'ts and judgments and anxiety-filled thoughts. It has the origin in craving because the mental activity reflects a craving for things to be how we want them to be. For example, if you stub your toe, that's dukkha dukkha. If you start worrying that you might stub your toe every time you walk, that's sankhara dukkha. The Buddha taught that the cycle of birth, aging, illness, and death is also a major source of suffering. The fear of death and the knowledge that we will inevitably face this kind of ultimate change adds to our sense of unease in suffering in the world. And this fear is compounded by the fact that death is often accompanied by physical pain and the loss of loved ones, further emphasizing the impermanence of all things and the inherent unsatisfactoriness of life. There's a story about a Sumai warrior and a Zen master, and there's a teaching on dukkha. The warrior was large and strong and had won many battles. The Zen master was a rather small old man and was well known far and wide for being one of the wisest and most compassionate people in the person in the land. The Sumai warrior went to the Zen master for instruction. "Please," the huge man asked, "teach me about heaven and hell." The Zen master scowled, then broke into mocking laughter. "Me teach you about heaven and hell? I wouldn't waste a moment trying to instruct the brain of an overweight ignoramus like you. How dare you ask me for such a lofty insight?" Well, upon hearing these words, the samurai grew furious, his face flushed, and he drew his sword to chop off the teacher's head. Just as he was about to strike, the master raised his hand and calmly said, "That, sir, is hell." Upon hearing this, the samurai suddenly realized the profound lesson the master had just taught him, that we make our own hell by indulging in anger and resentment. The warrior was so grateful for his teaching that he dropped his sword and fell to his knees in front of the master, bowing in humility and in gratitude. When he looked up, the old man was smiling. "And that, sir," the teacher said, "is heaven." Next, let's look at no self, or anatta in Pali, the third mark of existence. It holds that there's no enduring essence or core self, either within us or in anything in the world. The notion that we are separate beings is simply an illusion. The Buddha taught that understanding the nature of self is pivotal in achieving awakening and in reducing stress. Anatta teaches that the self is not a fixed, permanent entity, but rather a collection of constantly changing physical and mental processes. The Buddha likened the self to a chariot comprised of various parts, but not identical to any of the parts. Similarly, the self is composed of elements, parts. Could be elements such as thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, or body parts, but cannot be equated with any of these elements or parts. Anatta teaches that the self is not separate. It's not an independent, separate entity, but is interconnected with all other things. The Buddha taught that the self arises in dependence on other factors, such as the body, the mind, the environment, and it cannot exist independent of any of them. So our belief in a permanent, autonomous, separate self leads to this attachment and clinging, which in turn results in the disappointment and the suffering. When we identify with any aspect, like thoughts or emotions, sensations, we become attached to them, and when they alter or disappear, we experience dukkha or suffering. However, when we realize that the self is not a fixed entity or essence, we can relinquish our attachment, and by understanding that we're not separate entities, we can abandon our attempts to control life. And this results in a reduction of suffering that leads to greater wisdom and peace. Here's a personal story about seeing interconnection. Years ago, while wandering through a bustling shopping mall, I had a profound realization about the nature of self. I was caught up in the material world, enamored by the seemingly endless rows of products, each promising to bring me happiness and fulfillment. As I walked through the maze of appealing merchandise, a mother with a baby in her arms walked by. And in that moment, something shifted in me. I suddenly saw myself in that baby and the baby in me. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and I saw beyond the illusion of a separate self. And there was a feeling of deep inner connection, as if life was all one whole. I gazed around the mall, marveling at the realization that all people were me, and I was them. There was no distance, no separation. I felt this strong urge to kind of run up to people and tell them about our deep connection. I kind of realized that this wouldn't be a great thing to do, and I instead just sat down on a bench and watched as people, walked by, each a part of the larger unity that included everything and everyone. I saw that I was just one element in this grand tapestry of life, and that everything and everyone was connected to me in the same way. From that day on, I really had a shift in perspective. It was forever changed. The illusion of a separate self had been shattered in that moment, and in its place was a kind of a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. Impermanence can really be a doorway to seeing not self. Meditation provides a unique window to the selfless nature of reality, often through the lens of impermanence. As we move forward in our meditation practice, we start to perceive things with more clarity as they just come and go in each moment. And at the deepest levels of meditation, we may even experience sense consciousness, and I'll talk about this later in another talk, as impermanent. Recognizing that the very awareness that perceives these changes is also in a constant state of flux, changing. So the sense of self begins to fade, to drop away, and there's no longer this solid identity to cling to. So in this state, we're no longer identified with our experiences or the awareness that observes them. The ego and the witness become meaningless as we understand that everything is impermanent and in a constant state of change. There's no longer a fixed self to cling to, and the illusion of separation dissolves, revealing this kind of deeper understanding of interconnection with all things. Ignorance, as the Buddha calls it, and there are insights into the three marks that can overcome the ignorance. We see that the root of all our suffering lies in this ignorance of the way things truly are, the ignorance of the truth of existence, impermanence, suffering, and no self. And to shed light on this ignorance and bring an end to the cycle, we must delve into these truths kind of through a combination of our meditation practice and contemplation. So merely reading on the three marks is not enough. Listening to talks like this is not enough. True understanding only comes through seeing in our direct experience, seeing clearly in our direct experience through this, the practice of meditation. And there we can observe the fleeting and ever-changing nature of our experience, from shifting pain in our bodies that come and go, maybe the momentary pleasure of a cool breeze that can quickly turn into a chill, or a nagging thought that arises and then fades away, and then you may feel blissful, just by recognizing this constant changing of all things. And seeing this as a truth of our existence can really help us avoid creating unnecessary suffering. These three insights related to realizing the three marks are key to really knowing how the world works. They're at the heart of vipassana, or insight meditation. You could say that all the Buddha's teachings, all the various lists of different practices, ultimately take us as practitioners to seeing these three aspects. We could say that the three marks are the underlying realizations that bring us to awakening. I hope you found this talk helpful, and I will be giving 5 future talks on the 5 aggregates, which is the 5 aggregates of not self. And when we're practicing those 5 aggregates, we see how each of the aggregates is marked by those 3 aspects of being impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not an inherent self-nature. Hope you found this useful, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye, everyone.